Welcome! Tonight's story is about a woman who lived 1600 years ago in one of the greatest cities the world has ever known. A woman who understood the stars and the mathematics of the universe, who taught governors and bishops and philosophers with equal authority, who walked through the streets of Alexandria in her academic robes and spoke her mind freely in a world where women were expected to be silent. Her name was Hypatia, and her story is one of the most extraordinary in the history of human civilization, a story of intellectual brilliance, of a city at the edge of transformation, of the particular beauty and the particular danger of refusing to compromise what you believe to be true. Take a deep breath. Let your body settle. Let the present moment release you. Tonight, we travel to ancient Alexandria, to a city of 500,000 souls at the mouth of the Nile, where the greatest library in human history once stood, where philosophy and mathematics and astronomy flourished for centuries as the intellectual inheritance of the entire Mediterranean world. This is a slow journey, a gentle one. The kind of story that stays with you, that asks you to think about what it means to love knowledge and what it costs and why it matters. And if these stories bring you peace and help you rest, we would love for you to subscribe and turn on notifications so every new story finds its way to you. Leave us a comment. Tell us which historical figure you want us to explore next. Your voice shapes this journey. Now, breathe, and let Alexandria carry you. In the spring of 415 CE, 1600 years ago, a woman was riding in her carriage through the streets of Alexandria when a crowd stopped her. The crowd was not a mob in the disorganized sense. It was organized. It had a purpose. It had been assembled by a man named Peter, who was the reader of the Bishop of Alexandria, a minor church official acting, apparently, on behalf of more powerful interests. The crowd pulled the woman from her carriage. They dragged her into a nearby church, the Caesareum, the great temple that had been converted to Christian use and that still bore, on its exterior, the ancient obelisks that Julius Caesar and Augustus had placed there centuries before. And inside that church they killed her. Not quickly, not mercifully. They killed her with the kind of deliberate, methodical violence that requires not passion, but purpose, scraping the flesh from her bones with ceramic shards or with sharp roof tiles, tearing her body apart, burning what remained. The woman they killed was approximately 60 years old. She was a mathematician and an astronomer and a philosopher. She was the head of the Platonic school in Alexandria, the city's most respected intellectual institution. She was the teacher of governors and bishops and the most educated men of her time. Her name was Hypatia, and her death has been debated, mourned, analyzed, and argued over for 1600 years, because it was not simply the murder of a woman. It was, in a very specific and very important sense, the murder of an idea. The idea that the world could be understood, that the universe was rational and mathematical and accessible to the human mind. That inquiry was a virtue, that knowledge was worth defending with your life. Hypatia did not defend herself with violence. There is no record that she tried to flee or to arm herself or to call for help. What she did was go on teaching until the day she could not. This is her story, the story of the last great philosopher of the ancient world, the story of a city at the hinge of history, and the story of what happens when the light that a single, extraordinary person carries is suddenly, violently extinguished. This is Hypatia of Alexandria. To understand Hypatia, you must first understand Alexandria, because Alexandria was not simply a city, it was an idea, and the most ambitious urban idea of the ancient world, a deliberate creation designed from its founding to be the center of everything. Alexander the Great founded it in 331 BCE, choosing the site with the specific intention of creating the greatest city in the Mediterranean world. The location was almost perfect, on the Egyptian coast between the sea and the vast lake of Mareotis, connected by the Nile to the entire agricultural wealth of Egypt, positioned at the crossing of the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. After Alexander died, young, 32, in Babylon, his empire fragmenting before the body was cold, Egypt fell to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who would found the dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries, until Cleopatra VII was its last queen. The Ptolemies understood what Alexander had started at Alexandria, and they completed it. They built the library, the most ambitious knowledge project in the history of the ancient world, a systematic attempt to collect a copy of every text that had ever been written in every language from every corner of the known world. At its height, the Library of Alexandria held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, a number almost impossible to comprehend in the context of a world where every scroll was hand-copied and where most text existed in only a handful of copies. They built the Museion, the House of the Muses, the ancient world's closest approximation to a modern research university. Scholars were invited to Alexandria from across the Mediterranean world, given salaries and housing and library access, and encouraged to pursue whatever research interested them. At the Museion in Alexandria, Euclid wrote The Elements, the geometry textbook that was still being used in schools 2,000 years later. Archimedes studied before returning to Syracuse to develop the principles of levers and pulleys and the calculation of pi. Eratosthenes became the library's director and calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but a stick, a shadow, and the mathematics that Alexandria had taught him. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth moves around the Sun, not the other way around, 1,700 years before Copernicus would propose the same thing. This was Alexandria, the city where human beings for several centuries gathered to think as hard as they could about everything. By the time Hypatia was born, approximately 355 to 370 CE, the exact date is uncertain, Alexandria was already ancient. The great days of the Ptolemies were long past. The library in its original form had been damaged by fire during Julius Caesar's visit in 48 BCE, and its subsequent history is complicated and disputed. But the intellectual tradition that the library represented, the tradition of rigorous scholarship, of mathematical and philosophical inquiry, of the systematic pursuit of knowledge, was still alive. Hypatia was born into this tradition. Her father was Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer of significant reputation, the last known member of the Museion, the man who produced the critical editions of Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest that preserved those texts through the medieval period and into the modern world. Without Theon's editions, we might not have Euclid, we might not have Ptolemy. Theon was Hypatia's first and most important teacher, and he was, by the evidence, an extraordinary father. We know very little about Hypatia's childhood and youth. The ancient sources that describe her life were written after her death, with various degrees of accuracy and various agendas, and they tend to skip the early years in favor of the dramatic final act. But we can reconstruct something from what we know of her father, of the intellectual world of late antique Alexandria, and of the specific education that produced the woman the ancient sources describe. Theon of Alexandria was not a conventional man. In an era when the education of girls was not considered important or appropriate, when women were expected to manage households, raise children, and leave the thinking to men, Theon educated his daughter as if she were his most promising student, which she was. The ancient biographer Socrates Scholasticus, writing in the 5th century, says of Hypatia, that she far surpassed all the philosophers of her own time. This is the judgment of someone who had access to the living memory of people who knew her. It is not retrospective hagiography, it is contemporary assessment. She surpassed all the philosophers of her time. What did Theon's education consist of? Mathematics, the full Euclidean tradition, geometry and number theory, and the specific mathematical frameworks that the Alexandrian school had developed across its centuries of existence. Astronomy, the Ptolemaic system, the mathematical description of the movements of the heavens, the specific calculations required to predict eclipses, and the positions of planets. Hypatia would eventually write a commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, the great astronomical text that defined the field for 1,000 years, and her version of Theon's commentary on this work is what modern scholars believe they have when they study the text. Philosophy, the Platonic tradition, the philosophical framework that had come down from Plato through the Neoplatonist philosophers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the specific way of thinking about the relationship between the material world and the ideal forms that underlie it, rhetoric and dialectic, the arts of argument and persuasion that were the basic intellectual tools of the educated person in the ancient world. Theon also, according to the ancient sources, attended to his daughter's physical education, ensuring that she was not only intellectually capable but physically strong and healthy, understanding that the combination of a strong body and a strong mind produced a more complete human being than either alone. What was Hypatia like as a young person? We cannot know with certainty. The ancient sources that describe her are interested in the philosopher and the martyr, not in the child or the student. But we can make some inferences. A girl who was being educated as rigorously as Theon educated Hypatia would have spent the vast majority of her early years reading and calculating and arguing. She would have spent time at the library, or at whatever institutional successor to the library still existed in her time, working through the mathematical and philosophical texts that her father was himself studying. She would have been unusual, not only unusual for a girl, unusual for any young person of her time. The depth of mathematical and philosophical education that Hypatia received was rare. It was the education of the very small number of individuals who were destined to be scholars, to be teachers, to be the intellectual leaders of their communities. She would have known from relatively early that she was exceptional, and she would have understood from her father, from the tradition she was being educated into, from the specific intellectual culture of Alexandria, that being exceptional carried obligations. That the gift of understanding came with the responsibility to share that understanding, to teach, to illuminate. That knowledge was not for keeping, it was for giving. This understanding would shape everything that followed. By her late 20s or early 30s, sometime in the 380s and 390s CE, Hypatia had succeeded her father as the head of the Platonic school in Alexandria and had become the most celebrated intellectual in the city. This was not a minor achievement. Alexandria in the late 4th century CE was still one of the largest and most important cities in the Mediterranean world. A city of perhaps 500,000 people, the second city of the Roman Empire after Rome itself, the commercial and intellectual center of the Eastern Mediterranean. To be the foremost intellectual in Alexandria was to be, in a very meaningful sense, one of the most intellectually prominent people in the world. And Hypatia was this person. She taught in her home, which was also her school, a public space accessible to anyone who wished to come and learn. She lectured in the streets in the manner of the ancient philosophers who had always understood that philosophy was a public activity, not a private one. She was, by the ancient accounts, an extraordinary teacher. not merely knowledgeable but compelling, capable of taking the most abstract mathematical and philosophical concepts and making them vivid and comprehensible to people who came to her with little prior preparation. The ancient sources describe crowds gathering to hear her speak, not just students, citizens, officials, merchants, people who had heard that something interesting was being said and wanted to hear it for themselves. Her students were remarkable, and remarkably diverse. Synesius of Cyrene is the most important of her students for our purposes because he left behind a collection of letters. More than 150 letters, many of them addressed to Hypatia, that give us our most direct evidence of what she was like and what she taught. Synesius was not a simple student. He was a man of considerable intellectual ability who would eventually become the bishop of Ptolemais, a Christian bishop, one of the most important religious officials in his region. He was also deeply devoted to Hypatia, whom he had studied under in Alexandria, and with whom he maintained a correspondence for years after leaving the city. His letters to Hypatia are warm, intellectually engaged, and deeply respectful, addressing her as a teacher, as a friend, as an intellectual peer of the highest order. He asks her for astronomical instruments. He discusses philosophical problems. He seeks her advice on political and personal matters. From Synesius's letters we learn several things. That Hypatia taught both mathematics and philosophy. The two were not, in the ancient understanding, separate disciplines but aspects of a single inquiry into the nature of reality. That she had constructed or improved astronomical instruments. The astrolabe and the hydrometer are specifically mentioned in Synesius's letters as instruments that Hypatia had worked on. That her students came from across the Mediterranean world, from Cyrene, from Constantinople, from Syria, from everywhere that the reputation of Alexandrian learning reached, and that she commanded the affection and respect not just of her formal students, but of the political leadership of Alexandria, the governors and officials who were her contemporaries. One of the most remarkable aspects of Hypatia's life was the breadth of the different communities she bridged. In late 4th and early 5th century Alexandria, the city was divided between pagans who maintained the traditional Greco-Roman religious practices and Christians who were increasingly dominant politically and culturally, between the established intellectual elite and the new religious authorities, between the old world of the Roman imperial tradition and the emerging world of Christian late antiquity. Hypatia occupied a position that transcended these divisions. She was, as far as we can tell, a pagan in her personal philosophical commitments, a Neoplatonist in the tradition that understood the material world as a reflection of higher spiritual realities and that saw philosophical inquiry as a form of spiritual practice. But she taught Christians with the same generosity and the same rigor that she brought to teaching pagans. Synesius, who became a bishop, was one of her most devoted students. Other students who studied under her went on to prominent positions in the Christian church. She did not demand that her students share her religious commitments. She demanded that they think carefully, that they follow arguments wherever they led, that they bring honesty and rigor and humility to their intellectual work. Philosophy, in Hypatia's understanding, was not a religion to be defended or a sect to join. It was a practice, a way of engaging with reality that was available to anyone willing to commit to the disciplines it required. This position of principled intellectual openness was both her greatest strength and eventually the source of the tensions that led to her death. It is easy, in telling the story of Hypatia, to let the drama of her death overshadow the substance of her intellectual work. This would be a mistake, because Hypatia was not simply a victim. She was, first and most fundamentally, a mathematician and an astronomer of genuine distinction. a person who understood some of the most sophisticated mathematics of the ancient world and who contributed to the preservation and development of that mathematics in ways that have affected the history of human knowledge. What did Hypatia actually know? What was the mathematical world that she inhabited and contributed to? The mathematics of Hypatia's time was the culmination of several centuries of extraordinary Greek mathematical achievement, the tradition that ran from Euclid through Archimedes and Apollonius and Diophantus, building a body of mathematical knowledge that would not be surpassed in the Western tradition until the 17th century. Geometry, the Euclidean tradition, was the foundational mathematical discipline. Hypatia edited and wrote commentaries on her father Theon's edition of Euclid's Elements, the text that defined the discipline. Understanding what Hypatia did with this text means understanding that she was not simply copying. She was making editorial judgments, clarifying arguments, identifying and correcting errors, working at the level of someone who fully understood the mathematics and could improve on existing treatments of it. Algebra, specifically the work of Diophantus of Alexandria, the 3rd century mathematician whose Arithmetica was the most advanced work in what we would now call number theory and algebra. Hypatia is credited with writing a commentary on Diophantus, a commentary that may survive in embedded form in the texts of the Arithmetica that have come down to us. If this attribution is correct, then Hypatia's mathematical fingerprints are on one of the most important mathematical texts of antiquity. Astronomy, the Ptolemaic system, the mathematical description of the heavens developed by Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE. This system, which placed the Earth at the center and described the movements of the planets in terms of circles and epicycles, was mathematically sophisticated and practically useful, capable of predicting planetary positions with considerable accuracy. Hypatia wrote a commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, the great astronomical work, and on his handy tables, practical astronomical tables. The astrolabe, the instrument that Synesius's letters specifically connect to Hypatia, was a sophisticated astronomical computing device, a physical embodiment of mathematical and astronomical knowledge. It could be used to determine the time, to find the positions of stars, to solve astronomical problems that would otherwise require lengthy calculation. The hydrometer, another instrument mentioned by Synesius, was a device for measuring the density of liquids, an application of the physics that Archimedes had developed centuries earlier. What does this list tell us about Hypatia? It tells us she was not a popularizer or a dilettante. She was working at the frontier of the mathematical knowledge of her time. The texts she commented on were the most demanding mathematical works available. Texts that required years of preparation to understand and that demanded a level of mathematical sophistication that very few people in any era possess. She was not simply teaching mathematics, she was practicing it, pushing it forward, clarifying it, making it accessible to students who would carry it further. And she was doing all of this as a woman in a world where women were not expected to do mathematics at all. The ancient sources, even the ones that are critical of her, even the ones written by people who may have been sympathetic to the forces that killed her, never question her intellectual ability. They never suggest that she was pretending or that her reputation was undeserved. They agree uniformly that she was brilliant. The Alexandria that Hypatia lived in was not the serene city of learning that the Ptolemies had created. It was a city under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and the pressures were building toward a crisis that Hypatia would not survive. The Roman Empire was transforming. In 313 CE, less than a century before Hypatia's death, the Emperor Constantine had issued the Edict of Milan granting legal toleration to Christianity. And in 380 CE, during Hypatia's active teaching life, The Emperor Theodosius had gone further, declaring Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and beginning the systematic suppression of the traditional pagan religious practices. This transformation was not merely political, it was cultural, institutional, economic. The temples that had been the centers of traditional religious life were being closed or converted. The philosophical schools that had maintained the tradition of Platonic and Aristotelian inquiry were increasingly marginal, their intellectual framework rooted in a pagan understanding of the universe that was now officially displaced. Alexandria felt this transformation with particular intensity. In 391 CE, approximately 25 years before Hypatia's death, the great Serapeum of Alexandria was destroyed. The Serapeum was one of the most magnificent temple complexes in the ancient world, a vast structure on a hill in the western part of the city, dedicated to the god Serapis, containing the daughter library that held the remnants of the ancient collection after the original library building had been damaged. It was also a symbol of the old religion, of the old intellectual tradition, of the Alexandria that had been the center of Mediterranean learning for centuries. Theophilus, the bishop of Alexandria, organized its destruction. A Christian mob, possibly including monks from the desert communities outside the city, descended on the Serapeum and tore it apart. The event was traumatic. The ancient sources describe pagans defending the temple initially, killing some Christians, then retreating when the scale of the attack became clear. The statue of Serapis, one of the most celebrated divine images in the ancient world, was destroyed. The library that the Serapeum contained was looted or burned. The destruction of the Serapeum was a declaration. It announced that the old world was ending, that the intellectual and religious tradition that had sustained Alexandria for 7 centuries was no longer protected. Hypatia continued to teach. She continued to teach in the years immediately after the Serapeum's destruction, through the turbulent decade that followed into the early 5th century, when the tensions in Alexandria would build toward their final explosion. This was not naivete. Hypatia was not unaware of the changes happening around her. Her students wrote to her about them. Her position in the city, at the center of a network of educated, politically active men, gave her excellent information about what was happening. She continued to teach because she believed that what she was doing mattered more than the risk it carried. The relationship between the intellectual and political life of Alexandria in this period was embodied in one figure above all others. Orestes was the prefect of Alexandria, of the Roman governor of Egypt, in the early 5th century. He was a Christian, a man who had received Christian baptism from the Patriarch of Constantinople himself. He was also a former student of Hypatia's, a man who had studied under her and who maintained a close relationship with her throughout his time as prefect. His relationship with Hypatia was perfectly normal in the context of late antique intellectual culture. The governor maintaining a connection with the city's leading intellectual, consulting her on matters of policy and philosophy, respecting her judgment and her knowledge. But it was not normal in the eyes of Cyril, who became Bishop of Alexandria in 412 CE. Cyril was a man of extraordinary ability and extraordinary ambition, a theological mind of the first order who would eventually be recognized as a saint and doctor of the church. He was also ruthlessly political, willing to use any means available to extend the power of the Alexandrian church. And he saw in the relationship between Orestes and Hypatia a problem. The governor of Alexandria took counsel from a pagan philosopher, a woman, moreover, a woman who maintained the intellectual tradition of the old world and whose influence on the city's educated elite was demonstrably substantial. As long as Orestes listened to Hypatia, there was a competing voice in the room when Cyril spoke. The conflict between Cyril and Orestes had multiple dimensions: theological, political, personal. But at its heart, it was a conflict about who would control Alexandria. Would the city be governed by the Roman imperial system, represented by the prefect Orestes, or would it be governed by the bishop, the religious authority whose power was increasingly replacing the traditional Roman administrative structures? This was not a conflict unique to Alexandria. It was playing out across the Roman Empire in this period as the newly dominant Christian church found itself in competition with the imperial administrative apparatus for practical power over cities and their populations. But in Alexandria, the conflict was particularly intense. The city had a history of violence, riots, and conflicts between its various ethnic and religious communities were not unusual. The large Jewish community of Alexandria had long been in tension with the Greek-Egyptian majority. The newer Christian community had been growing rapidly and was increasingly assertive. In 415 CE, the year of Hypatia's death, the city was in a state of active conflict between Cyril's supporters and Orestes' administration. A series of incidents had escalated the tension. A conflict between Christians and Jews had resulted in violence on both sides. Orestes had punished a Christian who had attacked Jewish worshippers, publicly flogging him in the city's theatre. Cyril had responded by expelling Alexandria's Jewish community from the city, a drastic and illegal act that Orestes formally protested to Constantinople. A group of monks from the desert communities, men who combined extreme personal asceticism with extreme religious militancy, had come to the city and confronted Orestes directly in the street. One of them, a monk named Ammonius, threw a stone that struck the prefect and wounded him. Orestes had Ammonius arrested and tortured. The monk died under torture. Cyril declared him a martyr. The city was a tinderbox. And in the middle of all of this, Hypatia continued to teach. But something had changed. The relationship between Orestes and Hypatia, the continued consultation, the continued connection between the Roman governor and the pagan philosopher, was now politically charged in a way it had not been before. Socrates Scholasticus, writing in the 5th century, states directly that some of Cyril's supporters believed that Hypatia was the reason Orestes would not reconcile with the bishop. They believed, the text is clear about this, that her influence over the prefect was preventing the kind of political settlement that would give Cyril what he wanted. Whether this was true is impossible to say. The specific content of Hypatia's advice to Orestes is not recorded, but the perception, the belief held by powerful people that Hypatia's influence was a political obstacle was real. And perception, in the world of late antique politics, could be as dangerous as fact. The ancient historian Damasius, writing a century after the events, says that Cyril's supporters spread rumors about Hypatia, that she practiced magic, that she used her supposed powers to control the prefect, that her influence over men was the result of supernatural interference rather than genuine wisdom. These accusations were not casual, they were deliberate, designed to undermine the reputation of a woman whose intellectual authority was a threat to a specific political agenda. She was a philosopher, they called her a witch. She was a mathematician, they called her a sorceress. She was a teacher, they called her a manipulator. The accusations were false, but in a city on the edge of explosion, in a political environment where the old boundaries were collapsing, they were dangerous. We do not know exactly what happened on the day of Hypatia's death. We have accounts from Socrates Scholasticus, from Damasius, from later sources, that agree on the broad outline but differ on details. The accounts were written after the fact by people with their own perspectives and their own purposes, and they do not constitute a consistent or complete record of events. What the sources agree on is this. In March 415 CE, a group organized by Peter the Reader, an official of the Alexandrian church, ambushed Hypatia's carriage as she was making her way through the city. She was dragged from the carriage. She was taken to the Caesareum, the former temple, now a church. She was killed. The specific method of killing is described differently in different sources. Socrates Scholasticus says she was torn apart and her limbs burned. Damascius says she was stripped and killed with roof tiles, the specific ceramic shards or sharp tiles called ostraca. The details differ, but all sources agree that the killing was deliberate, organized, and exceptionally violent. She was approximately 60 years old. She had been teaching in Alexandria for perhaps 30 years. She had shaped the minds of governors and bishops and philosophers, and she was killed by a mob. The question that history has never stopped asking is, who was responsible? The ancient sources point different directions. Socrates Scholasticus, writing within a generation of the events, implicates Peter the reader, and, by implication, the broader circle of Cyril's supporters. He is careful to say that Cyril and the Alexandrian Church were associated with shameful acts by this event. Damascius, writing a century later and more sympathetic to the pagan philosophical tradition, is more direct in implicating Cyril personally. Modern historians have debated this for centuries. The consensus, such as it is, tends toward the view that the murder was organized by Cyril's faction, possibly by Cyril himself, possibly by subordinates acting on his behalf, possibly by people acting on their own initiative, but in an environment that Cyril had made dangerous. What is clear is that the murder was not spontaneous. The organization of the crowd, the specific targeting of Hypatia, the choice of a church as the location of the killing, these details suggest premeditation and deliberate purpose. Someone chose to end Hypatia's life. Someone chose this method. Someone gave the order or created the conditions in which someone else could give the order. We do not know exactly who. What we know is that after her death, the persecution of the pagan intellectual community in Alexandria intensified. The teachers and philosophers who had been her colleagues and students found themselves increasingly marginalized or forced to flee. The intellectual tradition that Hypatia had represented, the tradition of Alexandrian learning, of mathematical and philosophical inquiry in the Greek tradition, did not die with her. But it was severely wounded, and within a generation or two, the great lights of that tradition were gone from Alexandria, driven out or killed or simply unable to find the institutional support they needed to continue their work. The ancient world was ending. Hypatia's death was one of the most visible signs of that ending. One of the great frustrations of Hypatia's legacy is the question of her written work. She wrote. We know she wrote. The ancient sources describe her works, the commentary on Diophantus, the commentary on Apollonius of Perga's Conics, the commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, the addition of her father's commentary on Ptolemy's handy tables. Of all of this, nothing survives under her name. This is not unusual for ancient writers. The survival of ancient texts is a matter of accident and priority, of what medieval copyists chose to copy and what libraries managed to preserve through the centuries of disruption between the ancient world and the modern. Many ancient authors are known only from references in other works, their actual texts lost. But in Hypatia's case, the situation is complicated by a specific scholarly question. The edition of Theon's commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest that survives, the version that medieval scholars copied and that modern scholars study, is believed by many scholars to be substantially Hypatia's work rather than Theon's. Theon himself says in the text that the version of Book 3 of the commentary was prepared with the help of my philosopher daughter Hypatia. This reference is unusual. It's not common for ancient scholars to attribute work to their students or collaborators in this way. The specificity of the attribution suggests that Hypatia's contribution was substantial enough that Theon felt it needed to be acknowledged. If this is correct, then Hypatia's mathematical work survives. Embedded in her father's texts, attributed to him, but substantially hers. We have been reading Hypatia for centuries without knowing it. The commentary on Diophantus is more uncertain. Diophantus's Arithmetica, the collection of algebraic problems and solutions that represents the most advanced work in ancient algebra, survives in a form that some scholars believe contains later interpolations. Some of these interpolations show evidence of a particular kind of mathematical thinking that some scholars have argued is characteristic of Hypatia's approach to the material. If correct, this would mean that Hypatia's mathematical thinking is embedded in the most important algebraic text of antiquity, that her influence on the development of algebra is real, even if invisible behind her father's name and Diophantus's text. The evidence is not conclusive. Scholars continue to debate it. But the possibility is there that a woman killed 1600 years ago, whose own writings do not survive under her name, nonetheless shaped the mathematical tradition that eventually produced the algebra and the astronomy on which the scientific revolution was built. The influence of the forgotten, the legacy of the erased, the letters of Synesius of Cyrene are our most intimate window into Hypatia's world, not Hypatia as martyr or symbol, but Hypatia as teacher, as friend, as the specific person that her students knew and loved. Synesius was born approximately 370 CE, roughly the same generation as Hypatia, in Cyrene, the Greek city in what is now Libya. He came to Alexandria to study and found his way to Hypatia's school, where he studied for several years. He was, by his own account, devoted to her. His letters to her, written over many years after he left Alexandria, address her as mother, sister, teacher, using the terms of the deepest familial affection alongside the formal term of intellectual respect. This was not merely rhetorical convention. The letters themselves show the depth of the relationship, the intellectual trust, the personal warmth, the specific quality of connection between a teacher and a student who has become something more than a student. The letters give us specific, concrete information about Hypatia's work. In one letter, Synesius asks her to send him an astrolabe, a request that implies she had the knowledge and possibly the workshop to produce these instruments. The astrolabe was not a simple object. It required precise mathematical knowledge to design and significant craft skill to produce. The fact that Synesius turns to Hypatia for this instrument tells us something important about her practical engagement with mathematics and astronomy, that it was not merely theoretical but applied. In another letter, he asks for a hydrometer, again an instrument requiring both mathematical understanding and practical construction skill. He writes to her about his dreams, not asking her to interpret them, but sharing them as someone shares intimate thoughts with a trusted friend. He writes about his health, about the political difficulties he is experiencing as bishop, about the deaths of his children. He lost 3 sons in short succession, about his grief and his attempts to maintain philosophical equanimity in the face of personal tragedy. He writes to her about philosophy, specific philosophical problems, interpretations of Platonic texts, questions about the nature of the soul and its relationship to the divine. And running through all the letters is the specific texture of someone writing to a person they trust completely, a person whose judgment they defer to, whose understanding they rely on, whose presence in their intellectual and emotional life is genuinely important to them. From Synesius's letters, we can hear something of who Hypatia was, not the martyr, not the symbol, the person, specific and irreplaceable, the particular quality of intelligence and warmth and rigor that made people who encountered her want to keep encountering her, that made her students write to her for years after they had left her school, that made governors and bishops seek her counsel. The person who, one day in March 415, did not come home. Synesius died before Hypatia. approximately 413 CE, about 2 years before her murder. He did not know what happened to her. He did not have to write the letter of condolence, or the letter of outrage, or the letter of grief that the news of her death would have required. In a sense, he was spared, but we are left to imagine what he would have written. The man who called her mother and sister and teacher. The man who asked her for astronomical instruments and philosophical guidance, and simply for her presence in his life as a touchstone and a comfort. What would Synesius have written when he heard Hypatia died in 415 CE, and almost immediately the process of mythologizing her began? The immediate response to her death in the ancient world was complex. The historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing within a generation of the events, describes the murder as bringing great shame upon Cyril and upon the Alexandrian church, a strong judgment for a church historian to make about a bishop who would eventually be declared a saint. The philosopher Damascius, writing a century later, used Hypatia's death as the centerpiece of a philosophical and political argument about the decline of the ancient intellectual tradition under Christian dominance. For Damascius, Hypatia was not primarily a martyr. She was the symbol of a civilization being destroyed. For most of the next 1,000 years, Hypatia was largely forgotten by the Western European tradition, her name known to scholars, but her story not widely told, her significance not broadly recognized. The rediscovery of Hypatia as a cultural figure began in the Enlightenment, when European intellectuals engaged in their own conflicts between religious authority and rational inquiry, found in her story a powerful precedent and a powerful symbol. Voltaire mentioned her. Edward Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, told her story with evident sympathy and used it as evidence for his argument about the destructive effects of religious fanaticism. In the 19th century, the English novelist Charles Kingsley wrote a novel, Hypatia, published in 1853, that made her story widely known in the English-speaking world. Kingsley's novel is historically inaccurate in many details, but it introduced Hypatia to a mass readership and established her as a romantic and tragic figure in popular consciousness. The 20th century brought feminist historians to Hypatia, scholars who recognized in her story not just the tragedy of an individual, but the pattern of how women's intellectual contributions have been systematically erased, dismissed, or appropriated. The question of how much of the mathematical work attributed to her father was actually hers, and why it was attributed to him rather than to her, became a significant scholarly question. In 2009, the Spanish filmmaker Alejandro Amenabar released Agora, a film starring Rachel Weisz as Hypatia. The film was not entirely historically accurate, but it brought Hypatia's story to a new global audience and sparked renewed interest in her life and death. The Hypatia of the myth is not always the Hypatia of history. The myth has made her a pagan martyr, killed for her beliefs by a Christian mob. The history is more complicated. She was not killed specifically for being a pagan or specifically for her beliefs. She was killed because she was a political inconvenience, because her influence over the prefect Orestes was seen as an obstacle to Cyril's political agenda. The myth has made her a scientist versus religion figure, the rational mind against the forces of superstition. The history is more complicated. Her students included devout Christians. The conflict that killed her was not simply between reason and faith, but between competing political authorities in a city under enormous pressure. The myth has made her a perfect victim, purely innocent, purely noble, without complexity. The history gives us a more human figure, a person who made choices about where to live and what to teach and how to engage with the powers around her, some of those choices wise and some perhaps less so. But the myth is not entirely wrong. Hypatia was brilliant. She was killed for political reasons that were inseparable from her intellectual life. She represented a tradition of inquiry and reason that was genuinely threatened by the forces that killed her. And her death was genuinely a loss, not just for the individuals who loved her, but for the broader project of human understanding. The myth gets the emotional truth right, even when it gets the historical details wrong. We cannot tell Hypatia's story without telling the story of the Library of Alexandria, the institution that made her world possible and whose decline paralleled and prefigured her own. The Library of Alexandria is one of the most potent symbols in the history of human civilization. Not because of what it was, though what it was at its height was extraordinary, but because of what it represents, the human desire to collect, to preserve, to systematize knowledge. The belief that everything written down somewhere matters and should be saved. The understanding that the accumulated wisdom of the past is a resource for the future, that what people have understood before us is the foundation on which we build. The library was not simply a building full of books. It was a declaration that knowledge was worth caring about, that the contents of human minds, the observations of astronomers, the arguments of philosophers, the descriptions of physicians, the verses of poets, deserved to be treated with the same reverence that ancient peoples gave to the physical bodies of their gods. The library held texts in Egyptian and Aramaic and Hebrew and Persian and other languages alongside Greek, an early attempt at true universalism, the recognition that human wisdom was not the exclusive property of any single tradition. The history of the library's destruction is one of the most contested questions in the history of ancient scholarship. The traditional stories that Julius Caesar accidentally burned the library when fire from his ships spread to the harbor area in 48 BCE is almost certainly oversimplified. The library almost certainly suffered damage in the Caesar incident, but the scholarly consensus now holds that the library declined gradually over several centuries rather than being destroyed in a single catastrophic event. By Hypatia's time, the great original library was almost certainly significantly diminished from its height. The Serapeum's daughter library, burned by Theophilus in 391 CE, was the last significant institutional collection in Alexandria. But the intellectual tradition that the library represented was still alive in Hypatia's school. The texts that Euclid and Archimedes and Ptolemy had written were still being read, studied, commented on, transmitted to new students. The library as a building was gone or diminished. The library as a living intellectual practice, the idea that knowledge should be carefully maintained and passed on, was what Hypatia was doing every day in her teaching. In this sense, Hypatia herself was the library. She was the living embodiment of the tradition that the library had been built to preserve. And when she was killed, something of that tradition died with her, not completely. The texts survived, copied by scribes in Constantinople and Baghdad, preserved in the great Islamic libraries of the medieval period, eventually recovered by the European Renaissance, and integrated into the scientific tradition that produced the modern world. But the living chain of transmission, teacher to student, Alexandria to Alexandria, was broken. The library ended when Hypatia died. What did Hypatia actually contribute to mathematics and astronomy? This question is harder to answer than it should be, precisely because so much of what she wrote has survived, if at all, embedded in other people's texts without clear attribution. But let us attempt an accounting. The Ptolemaic tradition, the mathematical system for describing the movements of the heavens, was maintained and transmitted by Hypatia's work on her father's commentaries. Theon's editions of Ptolemy's texts were the versions that medieval astronomers, both in the Byzantine tradition and in the Islamic world, worked from. These editions incorporated Hypatia's contributions. This means that the mathematical tradition that eventually led to Copernicus, to Tycho Brahe, to Kepler, to the astronomical revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, the tradition passed through Hypatia's hands, not directly, through centuries of transmission and transformation. But the chain is real. The Diophantine tradition, the algebraic work of Diophantus, was similarly preserved in part through work that may be substantially Hypatia's. Diophantus's Arithmetica was rediscovered by European mathematicians in the 16th century and profoundly influenced the development of modern algebra. Pierre de Fermat famously scribbled his last theorem in the margin of a copy of Diophantus, a theorem that took mathematicians 300 years to prove. If Hypatia's work is embedded in the text of Diophantus, if the commentaries and clarifications that made that text accessible to later readers are partly hers, then her influence on the development of modern algebra may be substantial. The instruments, the astrolabe, the hydrometer, represent a different kind of contribution. These were practical tools, bridges between abstract mathematics and the everyday needs of navigation, timekeeping, and measurement. The astrolabe in particular was an extraordinarily important instrument in the medieval period, used by astronomers and navigators across the Islamic world, and eventually in medieval Europe. There is a particular quality to Hypatia's mathematical legacy that deserves emphasis. She was not only a discoverer of new mathematics, she was a preserver and transmitter of existing mathematics. The person who made the complex, demanding mathematical texts of the classical tradition accessible to students who would not otherwise have been able to understand them. This is not a lesser contribution than original discovery. In many ways, it is more important. New mathematical ideas are worthless if they are not transmitted. The history of mathematics is littered with discoveries that were made and then lost, made again, lost again, because the chain of transmission broke. The specific achievement of making difficult ideas comprehensible to the next generation of students is what keeps intellectual traditions alive. Hypatia kept alive for another generation a mathematical tradition that was in genuine danger of dying. Without her teaching, without her editions, without her commentaries, some of the mathematical knowledge of antiquity would have been lost earlier and recovered later. How much later? We cannot say. Mathematics has a way of being rediscovered. The truths it deals with are eternal and accessible to human reason from multiple directions. But the specific timing of when ideas are available matters. The history of science is sensitive to exactly when certain tools become available to certain people. Hypatia's work kept the tools available. In all the discussion of Hypatia, as symbol and martyr and mathematical legacy, it is easy to lose sight of the person. What was she actually like? The ancient sources agree on certain things. She was beautiful. Most of the ancient descriptions mention her appearance. This detail is both informative and frustrating. Informative because it tells us something about how the ancient world perceived her. Frustrating because it threatens to reduce a person of extraordinary intellectual achievement to her physical appearance. The ancient sources mention her beauty in the same breath as her intellect, as if the two were equally remarkable, which, in the context of their expectations about what a female philosopher would look like, perhaps they were. She was modest in her dress and manner. The ancient sources describe her wearing the philosopher's tribon, the distinctive cloak that marked the professional philosopher, and behaving with the public dignity appropriate to that role. She did not use her physical appearance to attract attention or influence. She commanded respect through her intellectual authority. She was celibate. The ancient sources agree on this, though they give different reasons. Some say it was by choice. Some suggest it was because her devotion to philosophy left no room for other commitments. She is described as having rejected suitors, including at least one who came to her as a student and developed feelings for her that went beyond intellectual admiration. Her response to this student, described differently in different sources, shows a woman who was not embarrassed by human sexuality, but who was clear about her own priorities. She was fearless. The ancient sources describe her moving through the city freely, without the escort or concealment that convention expected of respectable women. She engaged in public philosophical discourse with men in the streets and in public spaces without apparent anxiety about how this appeared to observers. This fearlessness is particularly striking given the climate of Alexandria in her final years. The city was volatile. Violence between religious communities was not uncommon. The organized attacks on pagan intellectuals and institutions were escalating. She knew the danger, she continued anyway. One story about Hypatia, told by Damascius, captures something about her character that the larger narrative sometimes obscures. A student came to her, he says, overcome by feelings for her. He had studied with her and had developed a passion that was not purely intellectual. Hypatia's response, in Damascius's version of the story, was neither cruelty nor embarrassment. She acknowledged his feelings, and then, apparently, she played music for him. The music, in Damascius's telling, was meant to show him something about the nature of desire, about the difference between the material and the spiritual, about what philosophy could offer that romantic love could not. Whether this story is historically accurate is impossible to say. It has the quality of an exemplary tale, a story told to illustrate a philosophical point rather than to record an actual event. But the quality of the response it describes, the musicianship, the philosophical gentleness, the refusal to mock or shame, feels consistent with what the other sources tell us about her character. She was not cold, she was not dismissive of human feeling, she was someone who understood feeling very well, who had been shaped by the love of knowledge, the love of truth, the love of the students who trusted her with their minds, and who brought that understanding to everything she did. After Hypatia's death, Orestes, the prefect whose connection to her had helped make her a target, disappears from the historical record. He presumably returned to Constantinople or moved to another posting. He does not appear again in the sources. Cyril, the bishop, who had, at minimum, created the political climate in which the murder became possible, was never charged with any crime in connection with it. He went on to become one of the most important theologians in the history of Christianity. He is venerated as a saint in the Catholic, Orthodox and Coptic churches. The feast of Saint Cyril is celebrated on multiple dates in different Christian traditions. He was declared a Doctor of the Church by Pope Leo XIII in 1882, a recognition of his theological contributions. The question of his responsibility for Hypatia's death has never been formally addressed by the churches that venerate him. Peter the Reader, the man who organized the crowd that killed Hypatia, appears in no other historical record. He vanishes after the murder, leaving no further trace. The intellectual community of Alexandria, the pagans and philosophers who had sustained the tradition that Hypatia represented, dispersed in the years and decades after her death. Some went to Athens, where the Platonic Academy survived until 529 CE, when the Emperor Justinian ordered it closed. Some went to Persia, where the Sassanid rulers offered patronage to scholars fleeing Christian persecution. Some simply blended into the increasingly Christian society of the late empire, abandoning the public practice of their philosophical tradition. The great age of Alexandrian learning was over. The texts survived, most of them. The mathematical works of Euclid and Archimedes and Apollonius and Ptolemy, preserved through the Byzantine scholarly tradition and through the Islamic scholars who translated them into Arabic in the 8th and 9th centuries, made their way into medieval Europe and provided the mathematical foundation for the scientific revolution. The philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, similarly preserved and transmitted, shaped European thought through the medieval and Renaissance periods. The specific intellectual tradition that Hypatia represented, the combination of mathematics and philosophy, of practical instrument making and abstract theoretical inquiry, of rigorous argument and genuine openness, was not entirely lost. It went underground, was transformed, was carried by different people in different institutions, and eventually resurfaced in the scientific culture of 17th century Europe. The light was not extinguished, it was carried in different hands, through different corridors for 1,000 years, and eventually it came back to illuminate the same questions that Hypatia had been asking about the stars and the mathematics of the universe and the nature of the human mind. 1,600 years after her death, why does Hypatia matter? The obvious answers are the ones that have been given repeatedly since the Enlightenment. She was a woman of exceptional intellectual ability in a world that did not expect women to have exceptional intellectual ability. She was killed for political reasons that were dressed up in religious language. Her death represents the kind of loss that happens when political power decides that certain kinds of knowledge are threatening. These answers are correct, but they are not the whole story. Hypatia matters because of what she was doing, not just because of what was done to her. She was doing something that every generation has to do for itself in its own specific circumstances. She was maintaining the claim that the world is comprehensible, that human beings can understand it, that the work of understanding it is worth doing. This claim is not self-evident. It is not guaranteed. History is full of moments when the claim was challenged, when the forces of dogma, of political convenience, of simple human fear, of the complexity that genuine understanding requires, pushed back against the project of inquiry. Hypatia's moment was one of those moments. The ancient world was changing, becoming something new, the specifically Christian civilization of medieval Europe. And in that process of change, some of what the ancient world had understood was at risk. She understood the risk. She stayed anyway, not because she was reckless, because she believed that the work she was doing mattered more than the personal safety she would have gained by stopping. The specific courage that Hypatia demonstrated is not the courage of the battlefield, the sudden adrenaline response to immediate danger. It is the quieter, more sustained courage of continuing to do what you believe is right in the face of a pressure that builds slowly and that never quite reaches the dramatic threshold that would make the right response obvious. She could have stopped teaching, she could have left Alexandria, she could have made accommodations with the new powers, emphasized the Christian students in her school, distanced herself from Orestes, retreated from the public intellectual life that made her visible. She did none of these things. Whether this was wisdom or stubbornness, or simply the inability to be other than what she was, we cannot know. The ancient sources do not give us access to her interior life in the weeks and months before her death. What they give us is the fact she continued to teach, to walk through the streets of her city, to maintain the relationships and the practices that defined her, until the day she could not. There is something else that Hypatia represents, something that the feminist and rationalist readings of her story sometimes miss. She was a teacher, not in the incidental sense, not someone who taught, because it was the only role available to women who wanted to use their minds. She was a teacher in the deepest sense, someone for whom the transmission of understanding to other people was not a secondary activity, but the central purpose of her intellectual life. The letters of Synesius give us this. The warmth of his letters, the specific quality of his devotion, the way he continued to seek her counsel and her friendship for years after he left her school. All of this tells us something about what Hypatia gave her students, not just knowledge, something harder to name and more important, the experience of being taken seriously, of having your questions treated as real questions, of being challenged to think harder and being supported in the attempt. This is what good teaching does, and Hypatia, by the evidence, was extraordinarily good at it. The students she shaped went on to be bishops and governors and philosophers, people of influence and ability who carried something of what she gave them into the world. Her legacy lives in them, and in what they did, and in what the people they influenced did in turn. The chain of transmission is harder to trace than a mathematical formula, but it is real. The Mediterranean is still there, the same sea that lapped against the shores of ancient Alexandria, that carried the grain ships and the merchant vessels and the occasional warship that reflected the light of the Pharos lighthouse in brilliant flashes visible for 40 miles, is still there. The lighthouse is gone. The library is gone. The city that Ptolemy built has been replaced by the modern city of Alexandria, still large and still Mediterranean, but no longer the center of the world in the way it once was. The stars are still there. The same stars that Hypatia tracked through her instruments, that she calculated the positions of, that she used to demonstrate the mathematical order of the universe to students who came to her from across the Mediterranean world. The Pleiades, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, the Milky Way stretching across the Egyptian sky on a clear night, the same river of light that the ancient world looked up at and tried to understand. She understood some of it, she tried to understand more. She taught what she understood to people who carried it further. The understanding she contributed to is now embodied in the mathematical physics and the astronomy that describe the universe with a precision and depth that would have astonished her. The ancient models she worked with have been replaced. The Ptolemaic system is not how we understand the solar system now, but the project is the same one she was engaged in. The project of trying to understand what is there, the project of trusting that the universe is comprehensible, the project of sharing what has been understood with the next generation and asking them to go further. 1600 years after her death, Hypatia has not been forgotten. She has been mythologized, simplified, made into a symbol for various causes, some of which she would have recognized, some of which she would not. The myth is imperfect, as all myths are. But the human being beneath the myth is still there, if you look carefully enough. A woman who loved mathematics, a woman who taught anyone who came to her, regardless of their religion or their social position. A woman who walked through the streets of her city in her philosopher's cloak and spoke her mind freely. A woman who was killed for the specific combination of who she was and when she lived. A woman whose students wept for her and whose enemies tried to erase her, and whose story has refused for 1600 years to be entirely erased. She is still teaching us. What she is teaching us is simple, that the work of understanding is worth doing, that the transmission of understanding is worth the risk it sometimes carries, that the particular combination of rigor and generosity that characterizes the best teachers and the best thinkers is one of the most valuable things a human being can embody, that the light, once lit, is very hard to entirely extinguish. Rest now. The Mediterranean is breathing. the same sea that Hypatia looked out at from the shores of Alexandria. The same stars she calculated and taught and loved. Still there? Still patient? Still waiting to be understood? Good night.